There are many sounds available on the computer audio workstations. You've got pianos, you've got guitars, you've got brass, you've got everything. There are some really good bass guitar ones around. However, a very often underused feature of any digital audio workstation is the sampler. People look at it and go, oh, that looks really complicated and it looks a bit clunky to use, and how would I use this? And yes, it takes ages to do this, that and the other. However, individuality is key, especially in this sort of modern era of third-party plugins and instruments, because they sound great, but obviously it's the same thing that everyone else has got on their computer. Wouldn't it be nice to have something individual? Well, here I have my trusty Fender bass, which has been through the wars, as you can see, and I'm going to sample each note on this. I'm going to do 2 octaves on this, because actually I'd like to have it on the left hand of my keyboard when I'm out gigging with chords on my right hand. It would be nice to have the same sound available on the left hand. How are we going to do this? Let's have a look. Here I am then with my bass. On the screen you can see Logic Pro X, which I'm using, and there's a tuner. So we've got to do a few preliminary things before we even think about doing any sampling at all. So I'm going to record each note from bottom E to top E. But I'm actually going to scale the neck in such a way that you don't get any sudden changes. So I'm going to go to B here, then C on the next string, to F sharp, and then G, C, C sharp to E. Of course there's going to be a bit of overlap, it's a bass guitar. Now if I just tune the bottom E string, for example, if I use a harmonic, you can see that the tuner wanders about a bit. See, it's in tune there or slightly flat. If I play it louder, it's going to go sharp. The answer is, you don't want to worry about it. As long as the thing is in tune with itself, and if you fret other notes, that they're reasonably close by. So, you've got to make sure that's right first. You can make very fine adjustments afterwards, but I wouldn't recommend it because of all of the processing that's needed to make it actually work properly. Now we've also got to get the recording level right. If I play the E string really loudly, it's right at the top of the meter, but it's not going into distortion. You also don't want it to be too low. You don't want to have to put gain stages or anything like that afterwards. Otherwise, you're going to get the sort of noise and any crackles and any pickup hum or any of that stuff. Obviously, I'm away from a transformer. There's no hum on this guitar at all. If I just leave the bass guitar open, so the pickup is live on the meter, it's not even registering -60. So we're in business. So I've got to press record on Logic. Now, I'm going to record a few different layers of the same note because I want to have loud notes and quiet notes. So you've got to decide, well, how many am I going to have? How accurate do I want this to be? And that's the problem, you see. If you get a really expensive piano sample, it's going to have lots and lots and lots of samples, whether the pedal's on or off. And of course, they're going to be in stereo as well. There's going to be all sorts of things. So actually sampling a bass guitar is much, much easier, which is one of the reasons I've chosen it for this demonstration. So I'm going to press record, and I'm going to record the E string a few times. Now I'm going to use the meter. On the bottom left here we've got this little orange 0.0. If I press cancel on that and then play a loud E string, I'm -2.4 dB below full scale. That's okay, that's fine. You can always bump up the overall level of the sampler when you come to play it back on your keyboard or whatever, but -2.4 is a good margin. We don't want any less than that in case it does go into distortion. You don't want that at all. So I'm going to record 5 samples. Just decided that. So I'm going to record a loud one, then I'm going to go down to sort of -6 dB, and then -12, -18, and maybe -24 or something like that. You don't want to look at figures too much. You want to play the guitar as though you are playing a quiet note. So here we go. I let the thing ring for as long as possible, because if you're at the end of a song, you want that. So now I'm going to reset the meter, and I'm going to play something a bit quieter, but still with power. What I did then was to stop the string right at the end with both my right thumb and just resting my finger, so you get a nice clean ending without any noises like that. So my third sample is going to be a bit quieter. So that's 3 samples so far. I'm going to continue in a minute, but you can pretty much guess that this is going to be a very long process. So I'll record a couple of notes, and then I'm just going to divide them up. And then in a few hours' time, I would have had all the notes recorded. This is laborious, but once you've got it, especially like me, if you're a keyboard player and you play the bass and chords, it's really handy to have your bass guitar unsullied by any processing and to have that level of dynamic range. You will thank yourself for it later. So I had a 12.5 dB note there. Yeah, so something minus 18 maybe. And then one more very quiet one, so I just reset the meter. That's my open E string. So what I'm actually going to do is to record from, I'm going to add another track that's exactly the same and keep going. So I've got E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, etc. going all the way along, so I can instantly see where my samples are. I don't want to go back to the beginning because I don't want to have to mute all the tracks, otherwise you get all the frets at once. Now, I've got to try and reproduce the F, the first fret on the bass guitar, with roughly the same dynamics. So this one here, that was 2.4. So if I just go back to I'm going to go to the end and record my F on here. See what happens if there we go. Because this is a fretted note, it won't last quite as long as that open string, mercifully. So I'll just record another one. I think it was at about -6. That's too quiet. That is as well. Now I'm just going to check that because I need my second sample of the F to be roughly the same level as my first sample. You can see how this can be very laborious. Yeah, -8. That's pretty much exactly the same as I had with that F. Let's just check that. For some reason oh yeah. There we go, -8.0 versus 8.1. How close can you get? Now, decibel scale wise, you're not going to worry too much within maybe 1 dB or so. The human ear can actually detect changes in really 2 dB and higher. So you're not going to go really sort of hammer and tongs with this, but I just need to make sure that it's as good as I can possibly get it. You want to try and adjust this now without having to do it afterwards. So there's a -12.5. So I'll just go to my F and just press record on that, and hopefully I can get a -12.5 on there as well. You have to reset it to make sure that it reads the same every time, or reads the correct value. Okay, here we go. A quick word about the number of samples I'm doing. I'm doing 5 of each. That's okay, because actually when you plug it into the sampler, each of those 5 samples is graded in volume as well, so you get a continuous sweep. So it's virtually indistinguishable when you sort of playing. You can't actually tell that another sample's kicked in as such. So I'm just going to check that first one, just to make sure what the 4th one is going to be. -17. Okay, so you can see that this process is just going to have to be repeated for each note. That's too loud. Let's reset the thing. And then lastly, I think I had a sample that was about -20 something. You could make a note on a piece of paper with this, just to make sure that you've got the right figures. So I'll just go to that last one. I've just increased the zoom a bit so I can see what's happening. It's -24. Okay, so I'm going to close the tuner. I'm not going to take any notice of it because it does waver around. It does change according to volume. Don't forget that a fretted instrument is really not sort of equal temperament, and this aren't exactly best friends. So I'm just going to -24 I need. There we go, something like that. Bit loud. Now, what I tend to do, I'm just going to stop filming now because I've got to do all the other notes, and then the next bit you see will be grouping these and exporting these and getting file names right. But we just got to make sure that you keep on the really straight and narrow with this, because when you've put them all into the sampler and you're playing on a keyboard, it's going to sound really good. Right, more of the same. So having spent about an hour playing those bass samples in, here they all are on the computer screen here. I've got 25 tracks to represent the 25 notes that I've put in. So it's 2 octaves, but obviously the final note makes it that 25 semitones rather than 24. So if I just go up to the top one here, I've got E0. It's very important to get the file names right, because actually when you import into the sampler, it looks for note names in order to put them in the correct place. You can adjust afterwards, but it turns into a bit of a hassle. So if I just zoom in on the first track here, you can see that that's my bottom E string. So I've got a loud sample. The next one. So I've got my 5 samples there. There's a little bit of a mistrigger there where I maybe just hit the pickup or did something, but I need to get rid of that. So there is a function called strip silence, which allows you to actually split these up automatically. That has to be taken with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because actually it can cut the very beginning off. What I tend to do is just to go through and increase the scale and just cut literally on the cusp of that note. Notice there's a tiny little pre-roll on it, but if I press play from here, it's instant. So let's find the next one. Now, so obviously zooming in and out, you can do that, and then put the cursor there and it'll zoom round it, dependent on the operating system or the program that you're using. But essentially what I need to do is to prepare these samples. So I need to get rid of that little bit there. Let's just get a shot of that, just so that we're dealing with the notes that we need. There are quite a lot of re-triggerings over the entire set, but actually this shouldn't take much longer than the playing that went in. Well, ideally I'd hope it wouldn't take an hour. It would take probably half an hour to do this. Now this is basically the procedure. You can zoom in on here. If you press that key, you can get, or just like a little magnifying glass, you can see a little bit easier. Don't worry about this. This is kind of screen resolution and potential noise as well from the pickup. Pickups are never silent, however much they say so on the box. So I've got 5 samples here. Now, it's just listening to the end of the first one. There's not really any level there at all. It's finished by about there. So I'm not going to worry about the whole sample really. And I could do the same with this one as well. And this one. Oh. Let's get rid of that. So I've got 5 clean samples now. Now what I could do, the ideal thing is to select them all and put a tiny little fade at the end. Just in case there's any little clicks in the recording. There we go, that's nice and clean. Now, the next thing to do, and I'm going to have to obviously do this for all of the other notes as well, but I'll just do it for the bottom E here, is to export these samples. Now, very importantly, you should not normalize anything. Normalizing means to bring them up to their maximum level because we want to maintain the dynamic range of the samples that we've just recorded. So now I've got to export these as samples, so I'm just going to zoom in on that track. Just make sure we can see what's happening. So these 5 samples here, I've got to store these in such a way that they can be loaded into the sampler very easily. Now the way it does this, the sampler will treat E0 as a note. It will recognize that, but actually I'm going to drag them onto the sampler at E0 itself. So I'm going to export this region as an audio file. I don't want to have any normalizing at all, nothing. No processing, just literally that raw audio file. And I'm going to call it E05, being the loudest. Then I'm going to go to this one, and this will be E04 and E03. It's nice and quick to do these samples, so things start to really roll after a while. You know, it might seem a laborious process, but actually it works really well. So E01. There we go. Now at the bottom of this I've got a sampler track open. I've got the sampler here, which is essentially you've got lots and lots of different things that you can play with. Mapping is what we're going to require, so I'll just get rid of those. That's what I did just now, and I'm going to import my precision samples, the ones that I've done so far. E01 and E05, everything in between. Now I'm going to drag it onto the keyboard where I want it, which is going to be there. So now I have the loudest sample, followed by the next loudest, and so on down to the bottom. Now these are arranged in velocity order, so if I hit the keyboard really loudly, it's going to play the loudest sample, and then just tickle the keyboard slightly, I get the quietest one. That's what I want. And that's basically how this is going to roll. Now, I've got to do this for the other 24 notes. So I've done all my samples now, and they appear in my window, just my usual Finder window, and then I can drag them into the sampler. I've already done E, F and F sharp right at the bottom, so the next one I need is G0. So this is why you have to make sure that your file names are really squeaky clean. So you just drag them all in here onto the G, and then they just import like that, and then you do for the G sharp. Make sure your octaves are right as well. You don't want to suddenly have the next octave up in the middle of your range, but you can adjust afterwards if there are any problems. You can do an awful lot with the sampler, and it's actually really very nice to use indeed. So the next thing to do would be to put all these samples in and then see what happens with a keyboard. And here we are. You can see the samples are all loaded into the sampler. There are 5 samples per key according to the loudness that you play. And I've hooked up my little MIDI keyboard to this. Let's see what happens. So here's the bottom E. So that's the second loudest sample. Then that's the next one down. And then the loudest one at the top. So the hope is that you can play now. At the moment, it sounds a little bit weird when you release the key. It sharply cuts off. That's the sort of thing where you can just go, well, the envelope of the sampler, you could actually just make the release time just a little bit longer. If I go all the way up, the note will continue. And that's not really very realistic at all. That's a bit better, it's a bit more subtle. The note doesn't cut off very, very suddenly, and you don't really want that anyway. Now you can, of course, change the velocities here. You can just get all of these notes, for example, and say, well, I only want that to be right at the top, when I want that sort of slappy sound to be, right at the top of the keyboard. And that means you can extend the range, perhaps, of these, so that you've got everything from 119 to 127. So you only want to really play that loud sample really when it's required. And you can play with all of this. And there it is. There's how to sample a bass guitar. Have fun.